This week in the Regency, we're looking at an interesting case of when is a murder not a murder, or rather, when is a murderer not a murderer? In other words, what happens when you kill someone in a duel? Now, I'm interested in this because I have a dueling scene in the book I'm currently writing, which is a murder mystery. And so I thought, oh, this is a good week to go look for duels. And the very first newspaper I looked at in the first week of October had a really interesting article about a duel in which someone was killed. And it was widely reported, but the one I'm going to quote from is from Johnson's Sunday Monitor. A fatal duel took place last week at Newcastle Inland, Carmarthenshire. Now, I just want to be really clear at the moment that this is not Newcastle upon Tyne. It is not the Newcastle of the Vera TV show or of the phrase Coles to Newcastle. It is, in fact, a village in Wales, Carmarthenshire. And this is what it looked like in 1815, which is when all this happened. And you can see it's not that big. And that becomes important later on. So it appears that a Mr. Hislop, a gentleman of respectable family, went to Newcastle to view an estate which was about to be sold, and was invited by Mr. B of that place to dinner on Thursday. The former, however, that is Mr. Hislop, the former, however, behaved in an unbecoming manner and used improper language, for which he was reprimanded. I imagine along the lines of, "We don't use that language in my house, sir." He then quitted the house and, presumably on the front lawn or on the steps, and challenged Mr. B to meet him in the morning. So that would be Friday morning. Mr. B, hoping that passion would subside, replied that he was engaged on the Friday. Yeah, sorry, can't duel with you, got something else on. But if he, that is Mr. Hislop, demanded it, would meet Mr. Hislop on the Saturday. Accordingly, on Saturday, the parties met, accompanied by their seconds, and on the word present being given, Mr. H requested Mr. B to stop. So what is to present? To present is to bring your pistols up at the ready, as in this image. Mr. B accordingly dropped the point of his pistol, and Mr. H then said, "Now make ready." That is, get back into firing position. This was done, and the ball from Mr. B's pistol shot Mr. H through the body, and he died almost immediately. Mr. H's pistol did not go off. In consequence, it is supposed of the flint being too long. And here is the bit that's got me really interested. A coroner's jury returned a verdict of willful murder against some person or persons unknown. So the coroner's jurors, they just went, "Oh, yes, Mr. B shot him, but we don't know who killed him." Now, presumably everything that's in that story was presented as evidence in the court. So the jurors were in no doubt whatsoever that it was Mr. B who had shot Mr. Hislop. But they weren't going to say that. And they had quite a lot of control in this situation. All sorts of things could be operating here. But first, let's look again at Newcastle Inland, which is a very small town, possibly a village, you would say. And Mr. B presumably was known to every single member on that jury. And there was no way they were going to have him up on a murder charge for a duel which, in their view, was forced upon him by Mr. Hislop. So I just found this really fascinating, and I went and had a look at coroner's juries. And it's very interesting because it's only in the 20th century that this changed. But at this point, sorry, late Victorian coroners changed, but coroner's juries pretty much stayed the same for quite a long time. And it's quite interesting. They were, a coroner was elected in the Regency period, and they didn't have to have any kind of training. They didn't have to be a doctor. They didn't have to be a lawyer. There's a story about a later election in, I think, 1875, where there were three candidates, a doctor, a lawyer, and an auctioneer, and it was the auctioneer who got elected. Who could elect a coroner was much broader than the actual franchise was for the rest of, like, for parliamentary elections. So women were allowed to vote if they owned property. A whole lot of people were allowed to vote who would not normally be allowed to vote in elections. And that's one of the reasons that the coroner's office was seen as being on the side of the people against the authorities. And part of their job was to investigate deaths in custody. And not only did they do that, but prisoners in deaths in custody were on the jury. And so it was very much seen as an office where they're there to make sure the rich and powerful don't get away with anything. So the election was much more a matter of local trust than it was having any kind of forensic training. And of course, there weren't that much, it's not that much forensic science available to people. So it was, you know, we elect someone we like, basically, or who pays us to elect them, or whatever. So we don't know who the crowner, the word coroner comes from the word crowner, because they were the representative of the crown. And in the early days, in the 11th and 12th centuries, they actually collected taxes. And they were appointed, and then things changed and they became elected, and their scope of duties became much smaller. So typically what would happen is that the coroner would be alerted to a death by the local parish police officer. They would alert the coroner, and the coroner would empanel a jury, and they would do it really quickly because the jury were entitled to view the body, and they always did. You know, they always wanted to have a look. So they would impanel a jury, and they would bring that jury usually to the largest common area in the village or town, and that was typically a pub. This is the Black Lion in Newcastle Island, and it's probably somewhere like this, which might have looked a bit like this on the inside. It's somewhere like this that they would have brought the jury, and it would have been jam-packed. Everyone from all over the place would have crammed into that pub. They would have kept the body in a different room with ice if they had it, but they often didn't. So that's why things had to be done with dispatch, because otherwise it would get very smelly. And those jurors, and this is true of 18th century and 19th century jurisprudence generally, that the jury often just refused to bring down the appropriate verdict. For example, where theft was concerned, theft was sometimes a hanging matter, and it was sometimes a transportation matter, and it was sometimes just, you know, in the local jail matter. And which you got depended on how the monetary value of what you had stolen, which is why horse thievery was a hanging offence, because horses were expensive. So quite often jurors would just say, oh, it's not worth that. That horse isn't worth anything. I'd only pay 2 shillings for that horse, and 2 shillings was like transportation rather than hanging. And so quite often jurors just decided on their own that they would have a particular verdict to save a defendant who was young. Quite often the kids got away with more, or was in some other way sympathetic. Or they knew him really well, like Mr. B. So I'm fascinated by this kind of insight into Regency justice, such as it is. Dueling was illegal, and technically Mr. B should have hanged. In this period, they can bring in a verdict against a specific person, and that acts as an arrest warrant. So we don't know whether Mr. B made for the continent, but if he did, his nearest and dearest would have written to him to say, safe to come back. Was it you after all? So there's just one more thing I wanted to look at, and that is the flintlock part of the story. So dueling pistols in this period were flintlocks. And the way a flintlock works is that the hammer, which was often at this point called the cock, because if you look at it, it kind of looks like a rooster pecking as it comes down. The hammer holds a flint. And a flint is a piece of very, very hard stone. And when you pull the trigger, that hammer comes down and hits the frizzen. Isn't that a fabulous word? I just love it. And there's no etymology. Nobody knows where it came from. People assume it's from German or Dutch, but they can't trace it back that far. I just love the frizzen. And the frizzen is steel. Now, if you've ever read something where someone says they had flint and steel to make a spark for a fire, it's exactly the same process. You strike the flint against the steel, the frizzen, it makes sparks, and those sparks fall into the pan, and the pan is full of gunpowder. And that gunpowder explodes, expands, and sends the bullet on its way. So what do they mean the flint was too long? If we go back to the original story, and it says, Mr. H's pistol did not go off. In consequence, it is supposed of the flint being too long. And when we look again at the striking point, this is when the flint is striking the frizzen, the steel, you can see that if it was longer, it wouldn't strike it at the right place for the sparks to fall into the pan. So this is, you can see that there's an arc that has to happen in order to get the sparks into the right place to get the pan. And if the steel is too long, it won't hit at the right point. So it was actually very, very delicate operation to get your flintlock pistol ready to kill someone. And Mr. Hislop, unfortunately, he paid the price of pushing a duel onto Mr. B. And that was clearly the opinion of the jury. And they decided that Mr. B, their local person whom they all knew, was not going to be hanged for the death of this stranger. So it's this whole story, although sad for Mr. Hislop and his friends and family, very sad indeed, it's a fascinating insight into how the jury system worked for deaths, how justice may or may not have happened, and how duels were regarded by ordinary men, always men on the jury. And when we look at how juries decide things in this period, well, what we can often see is the evidence of common culture, not the aristocrats, not the gentry, not the nobles, but what ordinary men thought about particular issues. It comes out in the verdicts that they hand down when they are on juries. And that's just fascinating. So that's this week in the Regency. I'm Elizabeth Layden. I'll see you next week in the Regency.